1988 seems to be something of a quiet before a storm. It was a year dominated by big console and arcade game releases. However, PC gaming's time in the sun is looming large. In a year where a Canadian is disqualified for doping, but an American isn't, and the Soviet Union slide further and further towards collapse, Enrico Palazzo serenaded the Queen on a state visit to the good old US of A. I'm the Geeky Dad, and this is a history of PC gaming. In 1988, we saw the first PC game to utilise a 3D engine. The Freescape Games engine allowed the rendering of full 3D environments, with floors, textures, and camera tracking. Jilla was the first game to use the Freescape engine, and consequently, the first game to use a full 3D engine. Jilla was a 3D game in the first person where you piloted a drilling craft around a moon that was going to collapse. Your mission was to drill to release the pressurised gas that was building up inside the moon. The game was ostensibly a 3D puzzle game, and the location of the drilling site had to be derived from clues around the level. The Freescape engine went on to be used in games like Castle Master, Total Eclipse. Game engines are widely used these days. Until this point, all games had to be built from the ground up, making use of the hardware available to the developers. Generally, when a game came out for a system, it was based on the hardware for that system. This is why other developers who didn't create a main game would be employed to create a game on another system's hardware. Game engines had existed up until this point, but they were mostly offered as a package to end users rather than in the industry to be used to make industry games. Jilla was the first commercially successful game built using a 3D engine. It was very well received by the gaming press at the time, getting 97% from Crash and 96% from Amstrad Action. War. War never changes. Wait, it's much too early to be using this line. However, the through line from Fallout runs right through this 1988 release from Interplay. Wasteland was a post-apocalyptic role-playing adventure which had mechanics based on the tabletop games Tunnels and Trolls, Mercenaries, Spies and Private Eyes. The rule set allowed for players to complete tasks in multiple ways. For example, if the user had a quest to eat a delicious pie, the user could put their cooking skills to great use, create a pie and eat it. They could amass some wealth to buy a delicious pie, or you could sneak into a bakery and steal a pie. Also, Wasteland was one of the first games that had a persisted world, where changes to the game world were stored and kept. Upon returning to an area later in the game, the player would find it in the state it had been left, rather than being reset, as was common for games at the time. Since hard drives were still rare in home computers of 1988, this meant the original game disc had to be copied first, as the manual instructed one to do so. Wasteland was well received by the gaming press of the time. Computer Gaming World awarded Wasteland its Adventure Game of the Year. However, one of the greatest things about Wasteland is its legacy. In 1997, Interplay wanted to create a sequel to Wasteland, however they weren't able to get a license to make the game from EA. As a result, they ended up changing the styling of their post-apocalyptic role-playing game and released Fallout. Fallout was considered to be one of the spiritual successors to Wasteland and included lots of little nods to the 1988 game. Also, in 2012, a highly successful Kickstarter campaign was launched for a true sequel to Wasteland 2, which came out 2 years later. Earlier in the episode, we talked about the use of 3D rendering engines. Well, in 1988, one of the first games that produced something resembling a realistic physics engine was released. Exile was released on the BBC microcomputer and featured a lot of things we'd consider to be a physics engine today. Gravity, inertia and mass were all modelled in the game. Exile also had all three of Newton's law of motions modelled, with many puzzles and gameplay elements emerging from a few physical principles. Not only did the game come with a physics engine, but early enemy AI was also in the game. Innovative routines such as realistic line of sight, enemies being aware of nearby noises and rushing to the point that a player character was last seen were all included. Exile was a game packed full of innovation, so much so that years later in 2010 the The Escapist magazine said, "Exile pioneered a lot of the science for which later games would become famous." Exile was doubly impressive because it came out on the BBC Micro. The restrictions placed on that machine meant memory was at a premium. Complex data was rendered to the screen. However, the BBC Model B, this data wouldn't be displayed to the end user. If you play the game on an Acorn Electron, this data could be seen on the screen. This wasn't the only extreme method used to get the game running on the BBC Micro. There was no indication on the screen of text in any form. There was no loading or saving routines. The only thing to indicate fuel and energy levels were a series of chimes. If something in the inventory needed to be checked, you could only do so by placing it into the player character's hands. Considering all these limits on the game, it's a marvel that it was so innovative and so well received. So that was 1988. Did any of you play Wasteland? What about the two games that were made with what came to be known as engines? Please leave me a comment down below telling me of your experiences. I've been the Geeky Dad, and this has been a history of PC gaming.